Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 73-74. Chapter 73, Argonaut. The Golden Hind limped its way towards the island, the area long since becoming clear. David blinked as he stared at the small dock section on the side. Huh, that wasn't there when I left. It wasn't. Ritska tilted his head, then turned back to it and frowned. So someone built it. Apparently so. David hummed. I guess they were expecting visitors at some point and decided to prepare the red carpet. He shrugged afterwards, turning to the master. Not that I feel we should complain, this turn of events means that we are still welcome here. Is that really what it means? Ritska wondered. Of course. David smiled. Why build a port if you aren't planning on receiving guests? He paused, then continued on. Also, it beats having to try and anchor the ship in the middle of the ocean and rowing out to the island, or trying to beach it on the sand and then pushing it back out when we want to leave again. Ritska opened his mouth to reply before he slowly closed it again. Good point. It wouldn't make sense to build a port on an island if you weren't planning on receiving guests, and considering they had already gotten a message from whoever David had stationed on the island, it made sense that they would try and welcome the man back. I'll try and dock at the port, Drake stated as she twirled the wheel of the ship, then grimaced. Although we're probably going to need to get a bit more work done, we only just got it fixed and all. Considering who we were fighting on the ship, Ritska trailed off meaningfully. Drake snorted and shook her head. Yeah, could have been worse. She sighed. So this treasure. Touching the Ark will kill you. David cheerfully remarked. Even I would die if I didn't have the correct permission at the time. He shrugged. It's just how things go. Also, I would like to point out that stealing is a sin. Yeah. Drake pouted, then gave an uncaring shrug. Even I know that there are some treasures that are better left untouched. She got disbelieving stares in return. What? Drake frowned, looking around at the incredulous expression. I've just been told that touching the thing will cause me to flat out die. What kind of idiot do you all take me for to actively try and steal something as cursed as that? David's smile strained slightly. I'm not sure how comfortable I am with you calling an artifact of God cursed. It kills people if they so much as touch it. Drake flatly replied, that's cursed no matter how you look at it. Again, it wouldn't be like that if people didn't touch it. David pointed out, all you need to do is not touch it. It's technically God, so we shouldn't really be touching it anyway. Isn't this Jason brat gonna touch it? No, Jason is going to try and get her, he pointed to Uriah, to touch it. He waved his hand. That's much worse. If he was the only one planning to touch it, then his stupidity would only get himself killed. Which, while still unfortunate, is not world-ending for the rest of us. And getting Uriah to touch it is bad. Boudica tilted her head in confusion. How so? You have yet to explain. Have I? David blinked in surprise. Oh, how silly of me. He chuckled, waving his hand. If she touches it, it will be world-ending. Ritska blinked at the man slowly. Beg pardon. World-ending. David reiterated. The master gave a second, much slower, blink in response to the sentence. Hey, Ritska reached up and scratched the back of his neck. Ah, that's what I thought you said. What? Well, gods are referred to as the avatars of the world, right? David looked around the ship at the numerous faces now staring at him. So obviously, if you were to sacrifice one of them to the Ark, it means that you seek to sacrifice the world. The man gave a shrug. Therefore, the Ark would seek to wipe out everything in this singularity in accordance with the wishes of the presumed sacrifice. Why are you telling us this now? Romani's voice was strangled as he desperately tried to keep his volume in check. This sounds like the sort of thing we should be informed of immediately. Well, I didn't want to cause any undue panic. David raised his hands. You would have freaked out if I told you that sacrificing Uriah to the Ark would have killed everything in this singularity. With good reason. Romani nodded his head rapidly, because that is something to be very worried about, and we should probably have been informed about ahead of time. He gestured through the monitor, especially considering we currently have a divine spirit with us. Hello. Artemis waved her hand at being pointed to. What are we talking about? End of the world. Ritska mutely voiced back. No biggie. All right. The goddess smiled, nodding her head and going back to humming to herself. This is a very big biggie. Ritska hissed at David with obvious irritation on his face. We're bringing the actual sacrifices to the Ark. All you need to do is just not let them touch it. David shrugged. I'm not seeing the issue, unless you were hoping they would. No, David. Ritska gave him a bland look. No one is hoping that. Then we have nothing to worry about. The king helpfully replied, spreading his arms wide and smiling. All we need to do is fight very hard to not let them get the Ark or to sacrifice anyone to it. He paused. Also, we can't move it either, I should point out. Because we'd die if we touched it. Yes. David nodded his head. We would die. Fantastic. Ritska's smile stretched from ear to ear and showed far too many teeth for it to be natural. The master spun on his heel. Mash. Yes, senpai. The shielder jolted to attention. Do you need something? No. Ritska replied with a perfectly calm voice. Just gonna stand over there and stare out at the ocean. He pointed off to the bow of the ship, probably until we land and disembark. Mash opened her mouth to respond before she slowly closed it, mutely nodding her head in affirmation while giving David a moderately disappointed expression. The archer was still standing in the middle of a large group of servants who were staring at him with poorly concealed irritation at his sudden reveal of quite how dire the situation truly was. I mean, does it really change anything? David voiced aloud, still looking moderately puzzled. We always intended to stop the Argonauts from getting the Ark, so really this should just make us more motivated to stop them. That aside, Mash politely interrupted, then frowned in thought. Why would anyone want to sacrifice a divine spirit to the Ark if that is the result? It does not make sense for someone to do that. David shrugged. Who knows? I can't say for certain why anyone would do that. It doesn't make sense unless they were the type to seek mass destruction and death. He frowned, and the Argonauts don't seem like a bunch, to be honest. Ritska remained silent the whole time before a thoughtful frown came to his face. The boy turned around to face the group. That's true enough. The Argonauts went on a quest for the Golden Fleece for Jason, right? That's true. Romani agreed. The Argos' quest for the Golden Fleece was part of Jason's quest to reclaim the throne of Iolcus after it was usurped by Peleus. While they did succeed in retrieving the fleece, the quest itself ended very terribly. Ritska nodded his head, then frowned. Wait, the manner in which Jason and Medea parted in the tale of the Argonauts would imply they wouldn't get along all that well as servants. Romani opened his mouth to reply, then closed his mouth. His eyes widened in realization. You're right. With Medea killing Jason's new wife and children, it wouldn't make sense for them to be working together as allies. More than that, everything Jason strove towards in the tales of the Argonauts was for himself to become king of his promised country. He might have been bitter he never got it, but he didn't act like it, did he? No, he didn't. Romani nodded his head. Something isn't adding up here. No, it isn't. Olga commented, the woman perched behind Romani with a thoughtful expression. Perhaps there is something else at work here. However, we can better think of our enemy's motives after we have set up defenses around the Ark. Hey! Drake shouted out from behind the steering wheel, we're coming into dock now. The woman twirled the wheel to line the ship up alongside the makeshift dock made of strung-together logs and branches. The ship slowed to a halt. Lower sails and drop anchor, the captain ordered as she stepped away from the wheel. What remained of the crew complied with her commands as they worked about the ship. The woman strode down the steps and onto the deck with a grimace, running her hand along the wood as she did so. Not gonna be sailing anywhere anytime soon, are ya? Sighing, the woman placed her hands on her hips and moved to the side of the ship. Get the boarding ramp down, we'll see what there is to see. Quite so. David grinned as he jogged up to stand next to her. Hopefully our resident guardian is still here. And if she ain't, well, the Ark is still here. David shrugged, so there is that. Drake rolled her eyes, moving across the deck of the ship at the assembled servants, and the rather sorry state they were in, before they turned back to the island itself. The crew members behind her moved past with the boarding plank to be in position for the ship to disembark. Let's go then everyone. David enthusiastically cried out as he was one of the first onto the panel. We've got precious little time as is. HMPH. Archer was the next one to follow after him. The tanned man kept his face blank as he descended down the ramp and onto the makeshift pier. The servant stared down at it before tapping his foot rather firmly twice to check its construction. After giving a satisfied nod, he turned back to the other servants and gave a single nod before shifting his attention away from them and moving across the dock. Certainly high stakes now, isn't it? Boudica commented as she followed after Ash. The unkindled saber frowned slightly, not that the rider could see his expression, as he debated her words before answering. Not really. He shrugged. These are rather common stakes for me. He turned around and raised an eyebrow, and they do not differ that much from our goal at large. Boudica blinked at him before nodding her head. I suppose that's true enough, but there's still nerves to consider. Especially when accounting for who we're fighting. I'm certain we shall pull through. Ash replied back without losing step. From what I understand, Heracles' advantage lies in the hope his adversary is not as well armed as me. He shrugged. Lothric has a habit of teaching you to carry a great many differing weapons with you at all times. That and despite his strength and acclaim, I am certain that I have felled tougher foes. That sounds a little overconfident. Boudica wryly pointed out as she followed after him. The saber gave a hum in response. Perhaps, however, from what I have seen he is pure strength with very little skill to account for it. He frowned. Perhaps in his current state, he is no different from a hollow. In which case, I have killed such beings before. He sighed. Besides, the ability to instantly return to life is not unusual for me to have encountered. Boudica titled her head. It isn't. No. Ash shook his head. The Watchers of Farron performed a similar feat, as did the twin princes of Lothric. All I need to do is continue to kill him until he stops reviving. The unkindled looked over his shoulder at the rider. The principle of combat remains very much the same. All I need to do is change my weapon after every mortal wound I deal him. Despite herself, Boudica couldn't help but chuckle. I wish I had your level of optimism, considering this is considered one of the strongest heroes in history. Ash paused. Really? Then shrugged. The Lords of Cinder all had the strength to light the fire flame itself. In that respect they could also be considered the strongest of their respective eras. The concept remains much the same. You're just confident from experience, aren't you? Boudica realized, crossing her arms and speeding up slightly until she walked alongside Ash. I suppose if we all had your track record of defeated opponents, we wouldn't be quite so worried about someone like Heracles. I will approach them as I will any other new foe I face. Ash reassured her, with the full belief that if they land so much as a single hit on me, I will die. That seems morbid but a very good motivator to not get hit. Having experienced it myself multiple times, I can assure you that it is quite a good motivator. Ash frowned. And I apparently no longer have the luxury of being able to rise again to continue my efforts of wearing down this Heracles. We'll all be there though. Boudica assured him. Besides, technically you'll need to fight Canius first. Although if you have killed, what did you call them again? Lords of Cinder. She crossed her arms and nodded to herself. That's it. I'm sure you'll be able to manage against her, right? I will most certainly try. Ash nodded his head. Her manner of fighting was brutal and eerily similar to that of Gundyr, which means I need only employ similar enough tactics to face her. He turned around to face the others as the pair stepped off the pseudo-pier and onto the beach. His arms crossed themselves in front of his chest as he waited. Just be careful. Boudica reminded him, you're a servant now, so you've got to worry about how your death would affect Master. He turned to stare in her direction, her eyes holding a subtle meaning to them. You aren't alone in this anymore. HMPH. Ash hummed in response. Boudica frowned as he clearly missed the not-so-subtle message, but that might have been her fault for expecting more from someone with limited interactions with other servants, or anyone, to be frank. The others were swiftly disembarking the ship and onto the pier, moving across the deck in the direction of the growing number of servants waiting on the beach of the island. Ritska moved to the front of the group and placed his hands on his hips. The boy frowned in thought for a few moments. So, do we just explore the island now? Yes. David nodded his head, walking past the master. This way. He punctuated the sentence by pointing into the thickest part of the tree line. She'll probably be waiting for us, or she might meet us there. He shrugged, whichever comes first, just so you're all aware not to instantly try and fight her. He reminded everyone. Oh, of course. Sanora shouted back. The woman winced and clutched her side as pain briefly flashed across her features. I would never dream of striking an ally. She managed to get out through gritted teeth. Her discomfort was rather obvious to the extent that Boudica paused in her walking and turned to the Lancer with a worried expression. Do you need help walking? She offered. Sanora stared at her for a few moments before she mutely nodded her head, her expression a mix between gratitude and embarrassment as the Lancer hooked her arm over Boudica's shoulder and allowed the woman to steady her. Thank you, milady. Sanora muttered under her breath. It's shameful for a knight to be forced into this position. Boudica gave her a raised eyebrow. I wouldn't call it shameful to receive help from your allies. She chuckled. Besides, I am a warrior queen. I'm used to this sort of thing. Sanora stared at her in open surprise. You are. Did I not mention it? Boudica blinked in surprise. Huh. I suppose it might not have come up before. She realized, nodding her head even as Sanora now looked downright horrified at the reveal that she was leaning on the shoulder of actual royalty. Stop that. The writer politely interrupted her with an amused smile, looking out of the corner of her eye to her fellow redhead. I'm not that much of a queen, so don't feel the need to treat me all that differently now. Her smile turned amused, although if my status means that much to you, I could always command that you accept the shoulder to lean on. She chuckled to herself at the expression Sanora made. The woman was experiencing what could only be described as a blue screen moment. What can we expect from the individual here? Archer asked as he walked behind David. Are you aware of all that much of them? David looked over his shoulder at the expectant faces and gave a calming smile. What to expect? She's a very noble soul. I can tell, it's a gift for these sorts of things, although she wasn't as comfortable with physical contact. Probably, just, you, Havel pointed out. David stared at the man in surprise before he allowed an incredulous smile to grace his lips. Was that an attempt at a joke? Havel just shrugged in response, prompting mild looks of amusement from all who heard. The king chuckled lightly before he composed himself. As for whether you believe we can trust her, that's entirely up to you, he replied before gesturing to himself, but keep in mind that I believed she was trustworthy enough to guard the Ark and protect it until we returned, so I hope that should at least give her some leeway. It does. Ritska assured the man with a smile of his own. If you trust her, David, then I don't see a reason not to. That sounds rather naive, Archer bluntly stated, looking down at his master with a raised eyebrow. Not all servants are quite as morally upstanding as you seem to believe. I'm not expecting everyone we meet to be a golden goose. Ritska replied back without shifting his expression, but if you go out of your way to distrust everyone you meet, you're not going to make many allies in life. I'm not saying that I would instantly trust the first words out of every servant I encounter, but I should at least give them the benefit of the doubt. Archer didn't have a rebuttal, instead he just stared at the master for a few moments before he shrugged and looked back at David. That's a very nice sentiment, Senpai. Mash praised, looking genuinely pleased by the announcement. I mean, it's a kind of goofy dumb. Drake bluntly stated, staring at Ritska with a lopsided smile, but it's a sort of goofy dumb that is hard to hate, although people will probably try to take advantage of that. Then it will be a good thing he has friends to prevent that. David piped up as he pushed through the shrubbery. I, for one, find that position to be a very good one to take. Trust is earned, but so is distrust, and hoping for the best of everyone you meet is nothing to dismiss. I would say it takes a greater strength to trust someone than to not. Back to the topic at hand. Archer cut through the comments. Are you at least aware of her class? Well, that seems obvious, right? David blinked. She shot an arrow at the boat. And our resident saber over there, he pointed at Ash, owns a rather large bow and throws fireballs. He then paused and looked at the saber. Do you have weapons aside from swords? Dozens. Ash admitted easily, spears, axes, bows, halberds. All right. David raised his hands in surrender. Fair enough. It does raise an interesting point though. Romani chose that moment to comment. What is the point of the class system if none of the servants are actually using the weapons they're supposed to? I mean, Arash uses a bow. Ritska pointed out, he still uses the weapons he's supposed to. I know, but it makes it a little difficult, right? Romani continued on, like if Ash hadn't introduced himself as a saber in his first conflict, he had used a spear, you'd have thought he was a lancer. Ritska blinked and shrugged. Fair enough. I suppose it does make things a little confusing. Not even talking about the mystery class that the servant in the previous singularity was summoned under. Romani frowned. Lucian. A foreigner class servant. Usually you only have the 7 major classes with only an extra class being allocated for ruler. But Lucian was a foreigner class. Ritska realized, and it doesn't tell us what we would expect from him at all. Exactly, just feels a little weird to be misled so easily. The man sighed, sorry, I distracted you all there. No, it's fine. Ritska shook his head, turning to David, so she's an archer. Yes. David agreed, she's also very at home in this sort of place. He chuckled as if he was let in on an inside joke. I dare say that he and our resident lancer have a few things in common. Good looks. Orion shouted out from the back of the queue. His next words were nothing more than panicked cries. Yes. David nodded sagely. I can hear you perfectly well. A feminine voice cut through the tree line. The servants all paused in their movements and looked about the forest as the voice seemingly echoed around them. Still, I can see you got my message. You almost struck someone with an arrow, but yes, we got it. David called back, placing his hands on his hips. Are you going to come and greet us, or are you more comfortable in the woods? A sigh echoed through the woods, soon followed by a blur moving amongst the trees before a rustle heralded the appearance of the woman. Ritska's eyes were instantly drawn to the top of her head. As were the eyes of everyone else. The woman wearing a green and black dress stared at the group with frown, her arms crossed in front of her chest and eyes slightly narrowed. Her hair at the front had a slight tinge of green to it which tapered out into messy blonde locks, although what was more standout were the pair of feline ears she had protruding from the top of her head. It was only next that the servants became aware of the flickering cat tail coming from behind her. Ash stared blankly at the display before he turned around to stare at Sanora. The lancer was similarly dumbfounded by the appearance before he looked down at the lion-shaped helmet in her grasp and then back at the woman in front of them. Ooh. He nodded his head, turning to David. I see what you meant. Not quite yet you do. He replied with a smile as he turned to the archer. Hello, you're looking. Save it. She cut him off, raising an eyebrow and looking over the group. I assume these are some friends you've found to help you with the arc. Yes. He nodded his head. Everyone, this is Atalanta. Atalanta jolted as the woman with long white hair and glowing blue eyes broke past the group and towards her, smiling wildly while the bear, that earned a double take from the feline archer, stared at her with pity. Look darling. It's Atalanta. What? Blinking, the woman stared at the floating individual before them and then at the bear and then towards David, obviously demanding an explanation. Atalanta, Mash whispered out, then blinked. Wait, as in the huntress. You know of me. The feline archer turned her attention towards Mash, her expression softened slightly at the sight of the shielder. Yes. Mash nodded her head, tensing slightly and flashing David a confused expression. You are also one of the Argonauts. Atalanta flinched. Ah, so you have met them, have you? Yeah. Ritska mutely nodded his head. Charming bunch. Jason's a great motivational speaker. Atalanta's lip twitched upwards slightly. You've never had to spend long periods of time with him. She replied, then sighed. Considering your state of wariness, I assume you have come to blows with them. She got nods from the group. I have long since split off from the Argonauts. I did so upon being summoned. Convenient. Archer mumbled under his breath, still looking at Atalanta with poorly veiled suspicion. Atalanta, for her part, only looked mildly irritated at the comment, however it quickly gave way to one of hesitant understanding. I would like to point out that the Argonauts are not currently here, before we begin to start suspecting people. David idly commented from the sidelines, then turned to Atalanta. However, I am curious as to how he was aware of it. Medea told him. Atalanta answered immediately, then shifted her expression into one of troubled concern. As for how she knew. She and Heracles had already been summoned when I was, after which Jason then explained his entire scheme to us and I decided that it was foolish and departed. Mash nodded her head in understanding. That must have been why they summoned Canius and Rendell to fill in their numbers. Atalanta jolted in surprise, her eyes widening in shock. Canis. She gaped. Canis is with them. The shielder rapidly nodded her head. That, she could stand Jason even less than I could. The archer gaped, then shook her head. Still. I did not think she would even answer a summoning at all. The second name is not familiar to me though. Different servant. The bear commented. Atalanta turned to it with a perturbed expression. Think of him as an out-of-towner. I see. Atalanta nodded her head, then shifted her eyes up to see the floating servant still smiling widely at her. And, your name is? E.H. The woman blinked, then her lip quivered as if she was going to cry. Darling. She whined loudly, clutching the bear tight to her chest. She doesn't recognize me. You talked to her through bears. Orion managed to get out. Bears. Bears. Atalanta blinked. What do? She trailed off, her eyes widening and slowly turning to the woman, her arms uncrossing themselves and going slack by her side. E.H. Ash watched the reaction with a raised eyebrow, then leaned towards Mash. What is the issue here? Atalanta is a legendary huntress and fervent follower of the goddess Artemis. Mash helpfully explained. Ah, so she was in the Artemis Covenant of Hunters. Ash realized, leaning back to his full height. Oh. Then winced. Meeting the patron deity of one's covenant was never something easily done and Artemis was perhaps the strangest god he had ever met in his life. She's making quite the amusing face, isn't she? Euryale commented, smirking at Atalanta continued to stare at Artemis with a full glaze in her eyes. Still, I don't suppose I could blame her all that much. Finding out the goddess you served all your life was like that is almost too horrible to comprehend. Hey! Artemis turned around to the group and pouted. I'm a very good patron goddess. She spun back around to the feline-eared archer. Aren't I, Atalanta? Tell them how good I am. Huh. The woman froze up. Ritska idly noted her tail did the exact same thing, much like a spooked cat, and let out a small grunt in response. What? This is a joke, right? She looked around at the others, all of whom kept their faces perfectly blank. Right. Ah. Her eyes fell on the bloodied redhead in dark gray armor as they unlatched themselves from their fellow redhead's shoulder. The young woman manifested a cross spear and planted the butt of the weapon into the ground, using it as a walking stick as they hobbled towards the archer with a welcoming smile on her face. So, you are a member of Lady Artemis' Covenant of Hunters. She stopped a foot from Atalanta and bowed her head slightly. An honor to meet. She drew in a sharp intake of breath, hissing loudly through her teeth. Sanora. Ritska called out to her, you good? Absolutely. You sure? No. The lancer quietly replied, still hunched over. My injuries from the brute still hurt. Atalanta stared at her with new understanding, and was slightly thankful for the distraction, as it became clear what occurred. You challenged Heracles, did you not? Yes. Sanora nodded her head, and Canis. Atalanta grunted in response. Orion stared at Atalanta for a few moments, then looked down at Sanora's armor design and then back towards Artemis before he frowned in thought. Hey. Artemis looked down at him. Yes, darling. Have you got a cat fetish? He asked aloud and with a dead serious expression. Silence spread across the forest as Atalanta slowly turned her head to stare at Orion with a horrifyingly blank expression. Ritska bit his lip and looked down at his shoes, suddenly finding them much more interesting than they had been moments earlier. Ash furrowed his brow, then raised his hand. What's a fetish? Not important. Ritska coughed into his hand, trying his level best to appear composed. Then turned around and noticed Ash with his hand raised in the air and stared at him. What are you doing? Ash returned the gaze with one of confusion. What do you mean? Why is your hand in the air? Ash stared at the limb and then back at Ritska, slowly lowering it. Astolfo said that one should raise their hand when asking a question. Was that incorrect? Ritska wasn't sure how to react. Technically no, but he was making a joke about your age. Boudica helpfully smiled, although she didn't even attempt to hide her mirth. Sorry. Oh, Ash grumbled, I see, then shrugged. It is most vexing to have my age frequently commented upon. You can complain about it later. Boudica offered, smiling at the saber, but it doesn't make it any less true, you know. Ash frowned, looking down. I am beginning to feel as though this is reflecting on how you view my competence as a warrior. He grumbled, crossing his arms, just because I am barely 3 months old. You're what? Ash jolted, turning his attention to the feline archer to find her staring at him with an expression a mix between surprise and horror. Quite what had spawned this new look was a mystery to him. Her lip curled into a snarl and then looked around the group. He's what? Ritska and Mash exchanged glances before they both turned back to the archer, who looked as though she was ready to start firing laser beams from her eyes. I feel like this needs a proper explanation. Ritska stepped forwards, trying his best to be civil. He then froze when Atalanta's eyes fell on him with what could only be described as righteous fury. Then by all means, she growled, her ears flickered back and her tail standing up straight. Explain. Ritska gulped. Which leaves me with 3 months of accumulated time. Ash finished, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed as Atalanta patiently waited in front of him. The other servants had long since dispersed throughout the woods in order to set up a defense around the entrance to the area which contained the ark. The entrance to the chamber was easily discovered. An intricate doorway carved into the rock face of a nearby rocky hill led into a passage within only a single hallway towards a main chamber. It was easy to defend in theory, less so in practice when the opponents were Heracles. Atalanta continued to stare at him with an unreadable expression for a few moments. In this new life, you have no memories at all of your previous life. None. Ash shook his head. It was disconcerting at first, but I believe I have been able to adjust myself. He paused, his lips pursing. I believed I had been able to adjust myself to interaction, but it seems as though there is much I am not used to. Atalanta hummed in response, slowly nodding her head. Mind of a child in the body of a man, she concluded, her expression very clearly showing her disgust with the predicament. I feel as though it would be a wasted effort to state I am not a child. Ash shrugged, so I will no longer bother. If that is how people feel comfortable viewing me, then that is what I shall be. Atalanta stared at him incredulously. And do you know the first thing about being a child? Ash remained silent. Does it matter? He asked, tilting his head. My age changes nothing about my duty. He sighed, leaning back and resting his head against the bark of the tree. This fascination of age concerns me greatly. I have already lived my life. No, you haven't. Atalanta cut him off sharply. Ash blinked and looked down at her, not even close. You began a second life without even the chance to live as a child. That is no life at all, and that it was taken from you so soon is an injustice I cannot stand. Huh. Ritska scratched his cheek as he stared out across the woods towards the direction that Ash and Atalanta had ventured off in. Are you all right, Senpai? Mash asked as she came to a stop next to him. Ritska turned to the shielder and gave a so-so gesture. Depends. Did Atalanta seem off to you when we mentioned Ash's age? He asked. Mash frowned but then nodded her head. Perhaps it is the matter of Ash-san's age. Ritska grunted, soon giving a noise of affirmation. Yeah. I suppose it's kind of easy to forget he's younger than both of us, isn't he? Very. Mash agreed. He does not act does he? She wondered aloud, then frowned. But perhaps I did not act like that as well. I don't know how children are supposed to act. Probably not like Ash. Ritska admitted, that's for sure. My liege. Ritska looked down to see Vrindari moving up the hill towards them. The shielder came to a halt a few feet from the pair and stood to attention. I have surveyed the land as instructed. Good. Ritska nodded, and the level of defenses I can craft will very much depend on how much time we have available to us. The servant admitted, apologize, my liege. I am not as skilled at this manner of strategy as Esser Rame. Romani's face popped up next to the master. We still aren't picking up the Argo within your immediate vicinity, the doctor reported, given the speed we witnessed last time with the fog. I can safely say that the moment they appear on our scanners, you'll have at least 5 hours. Ritska turned to Vrindari. The shielder's expression was hidden behind his helmet as he released a thoughtful hum. We can set up some pitfall traps. He nodded his head. It won't stop a servant for long, and from what I have heard will do little to this, Heracles, but it should be adequate enough to delay any of the more reasonably sized servants for a few seconds. Ritska nodded. Get on that. Very well. Vrindari nodded his head. We shall also get a shipment of spears down from Smith Andre to line the traps. I should also feel it necessary to warn our fellow servants to avoid falling into the traps as well. Yeah. Ritska nodded his head. That would be best. Thanks for the help, Vrindari. Vrindari bowed his head. Do not trouble yourself with thanks, my liege. I only wish I had the ability to help you more physically on the front lines. This is more than enough. Ritska assured him. If anything goes wrong, we can always use that other summoning system. I imagine Da Vinci probably wants to give it another try as well. Most definitely. Vrindari chuckled in response, turning around and walking back down the hill while shouting out commands and gesturing in different directions. Do you think Ash-san will be alright? Mash asked, looking more than a little concerned about her fellow servant. Ritska frowned and turned to her. If this singularity is anything to go by, he shrugged. I don't think he'll care. He honestly replied, I don't think half the words Atalanta told him about are going to make a bit of sense to him in the least. Really? Ash, Ritska sighed, I think it's just dawned on me just how different Ash's life is from mine. I knew that but, I don't know, he just feels as though he was doing whatever he wanted to make us more comfortable around him. Mash suggested. Ritska nodded his head in response. Yeah, like, he said the words but I don't think he actually understands what they mean at all. The master rubbed his forehead. Feel as though we'll have to worry about that when we get back though, maybe we should try and get him a hobby. A hobby? Mash blinked. Yeah, when he's not with us, he's in the simulator, being dragged about by CU or, just doing nothing. He frowned. I don't know if it would feel like I'm pushing too hard if I tried to get him into something. Hand him off to Da Vinci for a day. The pair jolted as Olga's voice came through the communicator. That would give him something to do. Mash giggled. I think that would give him too much to do, and Ash-san isn't used to Da Vinci's antics. I think he struggles around her. Olga grunted in response. I suppose that much is true. Although does it truly matter that much? He obeys your orders and has no complaints towards them. She pointed out with a frown. He has already demonstrated an unwillingness to engage or even entertain acts which could be considered wasteful. I doubt you could convince him to get a hobby. She sighed, but I suppose it would get him out of my office. Ritska and Mash blinked at her, the two exchanged glances and then turned back to the director. Your office? The pair asked in surprise. She nodded her head, frowning as she did so. He just walks in like he owns the place, sits down and then just does nothing. He'll only ever speak when I do, otherwise he'll just act like a glorified piece of furniture. He's like Stahl at times. Who's Stahl? Ritska tilted his head at the woman. The director froze and coughed into her hand. Given our growing number of servants of the same class, I felt it best to avoid confusion. Hence I have given my berserker the designation Stahl. Nice. Ritska nodded his head at her. Isn't Stahl the German word for steel? Mash inquired, staring at Olga in surprise. The director flushed slightly and looked away. Possibly, but it is a very accurate name. He's your servant. Ritska raised his hand in surrender. You can name him whatever you want. If it helps, I think it's a good name. Romani offered his 2 cents to the conversation. The director briefly glanced in his direction before she sighed, shaking her head and turning herself back to the master. Stahl aside, given the former allegiances of your most recent edition, how certain are you that she can be trusted? Olga asked, her face awash with suspicion. If we are to be believed, she immediately abandoned her former comrades and sought refuge on the island which contains the very ark that the Argonauts currently seek. Well, she had plenty of opportunities to kill me. Ritska pointed out, she could have waited in the trees and just sniped me with a bow. He does have a point. Romani admitted, Atalanta is a famed huntress and you did casually walk through the jungle she was living in at the time. It wouldn't have been too difficult for her to take out Fujimaru-kun in a surprise attack. Mash's expression faltered slightly, which caused Romani to instantly backpedal. Nothing against you, Mash. He hastily added in an attempt to comfort her, you're very good but even the best servants would be taken by surprise in an ambush. It's just a bad location for you to try and protect Fujimaru-kun. The shielder didn't look as comforted by the remark as the doctor had hoped. Ritska patted her on the shoulder, then looked back at the screen. As far as trusting her goes, I'd say she's earned the benefit of the doubt, like I said earlier. She could have killed me but didn't. The enemy saber could also have killed you, but didn't. Olga countered. Ritska gave a begrudging nod before he offered his rebuttal. True, but he's a knight. Atalanta isn't. Ritska smiled in triumph, so I think she would be less inclined to spare my life. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, dot, dot, dot. That is a horrible sentence I just said. Ritska realized with an expression of growing disturbance, I think I'm becoming too accustomed to threats against my life. You're a master. Olga flatly responded, everything you do is almost guaranteed to be a threat against your life. Ritska stared at her, then looked to Mash and leaned in to whisper to her, is that supposed to be reassuring or not? I don't know, senpai. Mash whispered back, I won't let anything happen to you though. She assured him with a confident nod of her head. I can hear you, you know. Olga pointed out with a tinge of annoyance, these communicators were designed to work even in instances where all you were capable of was whispering. Quote, dot, dot, dot. Sorry. Good. Archer watched with a raised eyebrow as their newest ally, he was personally still skeptical, marched out of the woods where she had dragged the saber off to. She emerged with a heavy scowl on her face and completely ignored his being entirely, striding past him and further up the hill towards where his master was. The tanned servant continued to stare at her retreating figure before he turned his head back to the direction of the woods as their resident saber emerged. Archer wasn't certain what manner of conversation they had, but it must have been something considering the saber looked more confused than anything else. He could just let it pass, he wasn't especially interested in whatever conversation they had, but considering it likely related to their newest add-on, it would be more prudent to ask the saber about it to determine what had upset their newest ally. Interesting talk, he voiced out as the saber made to walk past him. Ash paused and turned to the archer. His look of confusion not shifting in the least, the saber did indeed wear his emotions on his sleeve, as he stared at the archer and then back towards Atalanta. I am not certain. Ash admitted with a shrug, she had me explain my entire circumstances to her and whether or not I would regard my rising as a second life or not. And, well, considering I had no memories of my previous life at all, I considered it simply my first life. Ash replied, then frowned, at which point she proceeded to discuss my age and whether or not I would consider myself a child. You've made that clear. Ash nodded, that is what I believed. Apparently she regards me as having a stolen childhood, and then began to complain rather heavily about my circumstances and the fact I was a child forced into the body of a young adult. I told her I had no complaints about my current situation, which seemed to make the entire conversation worse. Archer could imagine, there was certainly a lot to unpack here and frankly, he wasn't the one to do it. To end the conversation, she called it a great injustice and how it highlighted the importance of her wish and then simply left. He stared at her before looking back at Archer. Many of the words she used have no meaning for me, so I will admit I was quite puzzled for much of her rant. I imagine you would be. Archer huffed, then threw a projected shovel towards the saber, who caught it rather easily in one hand. You should take that and start digging. We're setting up pitfall traps for the Argonauts. Ash nodded his head, his confusion vanishing instantly when presented with a new task. Archer could appreciate the need to separate his personal feelings for the more pressing concerns. However, there was something about the saber which just irked him. Perhaps it was the fact that he had no complaints about his role as a slave. Just a passive acceptance of his life, which was nothing more than a tool to be used and then discarded, without having ever considered the option of anything else, and then virtually spitting upon a type of life which didn't revolve around being used didn't sit right with him in the least. Still, the Iceni Queen had apparently taken it upon herself to try and educate him. Although he wasn't one for fighting lost causes. Whether or not the saber was one, that was something that only time would be able to tell. Where are we digging them? Ash asked. Archer threw a thumb over his shoulder to where Verndari's silver armor shone in the sun. The saber nodded his head and trudged past him at a hurried pace. Archer watched him leave with a blank expression. Even if he could be taught a better way of life than a tool, they all existed as servants to begin with. The moment he was summoned again, all that information would be lost. Whether it was better to learn how to live for however short a life he would have, or better to remain as he was and never have to worry about the fear of losing anything. That was a cruel thing to consider on either account. He was glad he wasn't the one having to worry about it. In the end, the pair of them were nothing but dogs to someone else's will. The tanned servant is another risk. Rendell informed the group as he leaned against the mast of the Argo. The weapon he had intended to use on Heracles was of better quality than the short swords he used against myself earlier. I believe him to be the holder of some manner of item box. Medea nodded along. I concur with Lord Rendell. While he is undoubtedly a physically weaker servant than Lord Heracles, I believe he might pose a risk through versatility. She frowned. He appeared to use gradation air to create the sword, however it was far superior to the items that can normally be grafted through the art. Jason stared at the two with a frown and narrowed eyes. You think some punk with a mildly better sword can suddenly take down Heracles? It is not just the tanned servant. Rendell pointed out, my concern also lies with the unkindled. During my time with Edward, one of the servants, Halphite, made repeated comments as to how the servant had invaded and brought the ringed city to ruin. Finally, Jason grinned, an actual villain to slay. It makes for a better story when you have accredited deeds to the great foes of your songs, doesn't it? Indeed. Rendell blandly responded, as I was saying, the ringed city itself was guarded by a dragon. A dragon slayer as well. Jason raised an eyebrow, frowning. Not bad, I suppose. But I doubt it poses much danger to Heracles. There was also the issue of his item box. Rendell continued on, his face showing mild straining from the continued interruptions. He utilized multiple noble phantasms during the fight, one of which was able to damage Teach's ship, while it was the home of half a dozen servants, one of which was an angel. As in actual angel, Canius piped up, looking more bemused than anything else, wings and all. I only know about these things from the Grail and from what I heard they play harps and shit. No. Rendell shook his head, the type which can clone themselves, teleport and throw balls of fire. The Lancer shrugged. Jason rolled his eyes. I certainly hope you aren't underestimating Heracles. He can deal with a few fools easily enough. They killed him twice. No, he was killed by a goddess in whatever that budget Heracles was. Jason dismissed, their monster is dead and Artemis has already been deployed. Heracles can deal with the servants, take back Euryale and then we can sacrifice her to the Ark. He crossed his arms, done. I feel as though you place too much confidence in Heracles. Of course I do. Jason cut him off, he's Heracles. The greatest hero in history, and it doesn't matter what manner of no-name or pitiful servants they field against him are. He is Heracles and will always win. The servant crossed his arms and nodded confidently, he could achieve my dream all by himself. Canius snorted, shaking her head, how he puts up with your pathetic ass, I don't know. She grunted, earning a brief scowl from the blonde, doesn't matter. I owe that fire-spewing prick a slow death anyway. He's mine and tell that big lug to keep clear of him. She warned with a snarl, understood. Jason gave her an unimpressed look, you want to fight the servant who so clearly beat you like a common dog. Canius bristled, rising to her feet, you wanna say that shit again you fucking. Please. Medea raised her hands, there is no need for conflict here. We all have the same objective. She gave a beatific smile as her eyes swept across the entire ship. Whatever grievances we have may be settled after we have achieved our objective. Her eyes fell on Canius, can they not? The Lancer stared at the caster with an indiscernible expression for a few moments before her lip curled into a shark-like grin. Well, doesn't matter. I'm sure it will all be funny in the end. She leaned back, the grin she gave the caster turned knowing, won't it? Medea continued to stare at the lancer with a calm expression, not giving away anything. She looked around, but that fucking bear and goddess are also mine as well. She announced, snarling at her fellow servants, right. Fine, fine. Jason waved his hand, completely uncaring as to her brash nature. Act as you will, just don't get in Heracles' way. You tell him to keep out of my way. She paused, looking behind herself to the servant in question. In fact, you stay the fuck out of my way. She leveled a finger at him. You got it, dumbass. Heracles stared at her without so much as shifting his expression in the least. Canius clicked her tongue and looked away. Like talking to a fucking rock. They've entered the range of detection. Romani informed the servants through the communicator, looking at their speed. You've got a little under 5 hours. They might have been restricted by the speed of the fog, but that's how long you've got. All right. Planning time, Ritska announced, clapping his hands together. We know that Canis has a personal grudge against you too. He pointed towards Artemis and Orion. So we're going to have to get her to pursue the both of you. His finger turned towards Euryale, and Heracles is going to go for you. We'll assume Rendell will as well. He exhaled. The issue is getting them to attack us on our terms. Jason is a coward. Atalanta revealed immediately. The archer stood next to Ash, who seemed more surprised about her sudden proximity but made no comment on it. The eyes of the servants fell on her. The moment he's threatened in any way, he's going to order Heracles to defend him. So, the moment we see the Argo, we just shoot at it. Ritska nodded, then turned to the 3 archers. How accurate are you all? The 3 servants stared at him in silence. That was a dumb question. He admitted, so, can you all target Jason then? The 3 nodded. He then looked at Euryale. You're going to be with me. He revealed. The entire audience stared at him. We're going to need to keep Heracles behind us, but not far enough that we lose him completely, which means I'm the obvious choice. Fujimaru-kun. Romani sputtered, that's obviously stupid. You can just as easily have one of the servants take her. We're going to need all of them to try and delay him until Ash can kill Canis, not to mention there is also Rendell to consider. The master pointed out with a grimace, his breathing slightly shaky. It means that I am the best choice. Senpai. That's, Mash tried to argue against, only for a voice to cut through the crowd of complaints. All right. Havel nodded to him. We'll keep safe. He affirmed to the master, then looked around at the other servants. Keep big. 1. Distribution, acted. David stared at the man in silence before he moved towards him and studied the larger berserker, then gave a nod of his head. I'm with him. He spoke as he gestured to the bishop. We'll keep Heracles at bay while you protect Euryale. He smiled at Ritska. It's a pretty difficult task, you sure you're up for it? Yeah. Ritska nodded his head. Makes sense, right? He looked around with a shaky expression. Me and Euryale aren't really frontline troops and you need all the help you can get for fighting Heracles and Rendell. We can't really lost anyone to protect Euryale, so I'll do it. Euryale stared at him, then slowly nodded her head. All right then. She smiled. I will grant you the honor of protecting this goddess. I don't expect you to do as well as Asterios, but I'm certain you'll manage in your own way. That's an endorsement if ever I've heard one. He muttered under his breath, then looked towards Mash, the shielder still looking unsure about the plan. Mash, you know it's the best plan we have. We need to delay Heracles and take out Rendell. We're already losing an Artemis to deal with Canis. This isn't the time to be short-staffed. That's, Mash bit her lip, remaining silent for a few moments before she exhaled, raising her shield up and then thumping it back into the ground and slamming her right hand onto her chest. As you command, Master. I will give my all to protecting you with the power I have obtained from Oscar-san. Ritska cracked a smile, nodding at her. I'm counting on you then. This plan is batshit crazy. Drake pointed out, placing her hands on her hips. I can tell you all that right now. I'm in. Her lips split into a wide grin. I ain't drunk enough to say yes to it, but hell if I'm going to miss out on it. That's Drake for you. Ritska rolled his eyes, then looked around. Everyone understand the plan then? Yes. Ash nodded his head. Once I have dealt with Canius, I will inform you via the link and you can summon me with a command seal. We're counting on you, Ash. He spoke in a serious tone, then looked around. We've got 5 hours left. Let's get these traps finished up. He paused, then spoke again. Also, we're going to have to work out a path for me to take so I don't accidentally trigger them. We can work on that as we build them. Sanora informed him. The Lancer was no longer limping heavily, however, there were still signs of damage on her person. I admit to not being as skilled at trapping as some of the others here, but I will give it my all. It's all right, Sani. Artemis assured her, then floated around and placed a hand on Atalanta's back and pushed her forward slightly. Me and Atalanta will help you. Darling is also really good at it. Wah. Atalanta turned around to face the goddess, her mouth flapping as it struggled to form a sentence before her lips pulled themselves into a thin line. Her eyes turned downwards slightly. Yes, Lady Artemis. Ritska stared at the huntress before he called out to her, if it makes you feel better. Gwyndolin reacted very similarly to Artemis. Who? Atalanta stared at him with obvious confusion. God of the Moon. Ritska informed with a nod. He didn't take it well. Atalanta stared at him with a blank expression, then turned back to Artemis as she cuddled the stuffed bear close to her chest and then turned back to Ritska. She gave a groan of what was either annoyance or exasperation. Either way, she was still struggling to determine how she felt about meeting Artemis and finding out what her personality was. Jason moved to the front of the Argo as the island came into greater view. The blonde-haired man kept his confident grin on his face as the distant image grew in size. The smile remained on his face, even as Medea abruptly shifted her expression into a more concerned one as she looked up at the sky and widened her eyes. Heracles moved, a large hand instantly wrapping itself around Jason's collar and yanking him backwards. At the same time he threw his body around the front of the blonde man and used his entire body as a shield. Canius looked up and raised an eyebrow, her lips remaining in a thin line as the sky suddenly split open. Flickering lights spread across the horizon and grew in intensity as they closed in on the boat. Medea chanted rapidly under her breath and raised her hand upwards, a thin barrier forming in front of herself and Rendell while Canius stood in the open. Thousands of glowing arrows instantly descended upon the Argo. The glowing shafts struck the ship at rapid speeds and began to split holes in the deck of the ship, all the while Jason continued to let out a panicked scream as the bombardment continued. Canius stood in the open as the arrows rained down upon them. The glowing shafts struck her body and ricocheted off, causing her to barely move even as they struck her face. When the barrage began to die down, there was a perfect outline of Canius' body in the deck of the ship behind where she had stood. The Lancer looked over her shoulder at the small clearing in the ship and then looked about the arrow-filled deck before she shrugged. Guess we found where the little hunter went. Coward. Jason cried out, loosing arrows at someone instead of coming in close and attacking them directly. He peeked his head out from behind Heracles. Go and get them. He ordered, pointing towards the island. Heracles slowly rose to his full height, turning around and glaring out across the horizon towards the island. His body tensed as he crouched low in preparation to launch himself. He kicked off the Argo with enough force to rock the ship slightly, his form disappearing into a blur moving across the sky as he rocketed towards the island. Canius strode past Jason and Medea, resting her boot upon the railings of the ship and then jumping off, diving into the ocean and jetting through the water towards the island. Rendell remained stationary, turning his head towards Jason and Medea. We're going to need to move the ship closer if I am to join them. He pointed out, I can neither jump that far, nor can I swim that fast. Jason sighed. Heracles doesn't need any help. He pointed out, leveling a finger at the king, you're going to stay here and wait until Heracles comes back. Rendell stared at him, then to Medea, then back at him. I can only hope your overconfidence in your friend does not spell disaster for us. He took several steps backwards, then looked at Medea, is this truly all right? He whispered to her, my being there offers a greater chance for success. Lord Jason has spoken. Medea replied confidently, smiling up at the king, besides, there are other options available if Lord Heracles fails. Her eyes flickered back to Jason, drawing a suspicious glance from the king before a shrug. As you wish, master. Fight begins next chapter. Ash and Artemis versus Canis and everyone versus Heracles. In truth, I had hoped to begin the fight in this chapter, but then I noticed the size of the chapter and realized all the character interaction had gotten big. But I don't mind, I'd rather people care more about the characters than anything else. Sorry again, but I figured it would be weird if we instantly jumped into fighting without first the characters all interacting and all that. Also, they had enough time to set up traps and it gives Verndari a chance to shine with his skill and the other hunter-type servants. Get used to everyone and all that. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 74, Battle Continuation. Here he comes, Ritska muttered under his breath as he watched the darkened form of Heracles shoot across the sky towards the beach. He could feel his heart rate already beginning to speed up as the berserker approached. Euryale looked up at him as he held her bridal style. The goddess raised an eyebrow at his demeanor before she leaned in closer to him and whispered. You should stop shivering so much. She informed him, earning a quick glance from the master. It's not very heroic of you to say you'll protect me and then start panicking. Ritska couldn't help the slight smile at the remark. Yeah, but this is Heracles. I think I'm allowed to be a little panicky. He whispered back to her, earning a melodious giggle from the goddess before the pair turned their attention back towards the falling comet that was the Greek demigod. Heracles slammed into the beach with a thunderous crash, instantly blasting out a shockwave from his landing site and kicking up a mushroom cloud of sand. Ritska closed his eyes as the storm of debris washed over him and coated his uniform and hair in a thin layer of sand. Euryale scowled as she was similarly coated in it. The goddess sent him a disappointed expression, obviously expecting him to have shielded her body. As he opened his eyes again, Ritska watched as the cloud began to disperse, revealing the full form of Heracles as he rose up from the crater on the seashore. The berserker stomped out of his landing site and swept his glowing eyes across the beach before they landed on him. A deep reverberating growl emanated from the berserker as they shifted their entire body to face him fully. Fujimaru-kun. Romani broke him out of his terrified state with a frantic shout of his own, run. Ritska didn't need to be told twice, instantly turning on his heel and sprinting as fast as he could towards the thick brush of the forest. Heracles let out a roar behind him which only served to motivate him into sprinting faster than he thought possible. The low boom of the berserker breaking into a run and the crashing steps did nothing to ease his nerves in the least. The moment he passed through the greenery into the tree line, he locked eyes with the half-dozen servants already waiting for him. The group nodded their heads as he sprinted past them and shifted their attention back towards the direction they knew Heracles would be charging from. Sure enough, moments later, Heracles came tearing through the forest, ripping up trees by their roots and sending them skywards as he rushed after the master and the goddess. Get him! It was difficult to discern who had shouted out the command, but it didn't matter as the servants instantly complied with the remark. Archer loosened dozens of arrows at Heracles and instantly obscured his vision with their subsequent explosions. The berserker growled and swept his hand through the air to disperse the smoke cloud. Just in time to see Havel's fist rocketing towards his face, The heavy gauntlet collided with Heracles, Chikan snapped his entire body to the side. The force of the impact released an explosion of air which shattered the ground beneath the pair of berserkers' feet and blasted the leaves off of the nearby trees. Havel followed the haymaker with an uppercut into Heracles' gut, briefly lifting the berserker off his feet and into a slight stumble backwards. The moment Heracles' feet touched the ground, he shifted his body forwards and launched himself at the stone bishop like a bullet. Clearing the distance between the two instantly and shoulder barging him into the ground, Havel rolled with the impact only for Heracles' free hand to roughly grip his leg and lift him into the air. The demigod released an ear-splitting roar as he swung Havel above his head like a rag doll before hurling him through the woods. Whatever trees got in his way were disintegrated when he impacted them and continued to fly through them. The distant explosion when he finally landed snapped the servants out of their shocked states and shifted their attention back towards Heracles. The servant threw his head back and released another roar as the battle started up again. Making to charge forwards, he was halted as a heavy shield was slammed directly into his path. Glowing eyes locked onto the wielder as Mash shifted herself to prepare for any impact or to make ready an attack. The girl's eyes fixed themselves onto Heracles with steeled determination. Growling, Heracles gripped his slab with two hands and raised it above his head before throwing himself forwards at the shielder. Mash released a cry of her own as she pulled the shield out of the ground and pivoted towards the berserker like a spear and threw it towards his weapon. The two attacks collided with each other and released a reverberating thud. Mash's feet dug into the ground to support herself, her expression straining as Heracles forced more strength into his shoving match. Ha! Mash's cry emanated from deep within her as her body glowed a subtle hue. Power exploded forth as she shifted the slab to the side, throwing Heracles off balance and causing his attack to slam into the ground at the same time she coiled her arm back. Heracles' eyes locked onto her as she thrust her arm forwards like a lance and struck him in the chest with the bottom of the shield. The attack blasted the servant backwards, his legs digging into the ground to halt his retreat and leaving deep indentations in the ground. Heracles righted his body and glared at the shielder as she matched his glare with a cool expression. With the power granted to me by Sir Oscar of Astora. She shifted her body to ready herself, lips pulled into a tight frown. I won't allow you to threaten my master. Heracles growled, eyes shifting to either side as Sanora and Boudica dropped down on each respective flank, leveling their weapons at him. From behind Mash, he could see David step out from behind a tree with a calm look on his face, soon followed by Francis Drake, and while he couldn't see them, Heracles could sense the presence of more servants in the bushes. However, what was at the forefront of his mind was the knowledge that as long as the goddess lived, Jason would be in danger. Even through the shroud of madness, that singular thought resonated with his entire being. His friend was in danger, and unless he killed that goddess, that was how he would remain. That thought pushed him forwards, his body shifted and he assumed a stance. The flat of his palm extended towards the servants in front of him while he held his sword at his side, eyes shifting left and right to check for attacks on either side. He loosened a rumbling growl as he moved. Spinning on his heel and swinging his sword towards Boudica, the rider widened her eyes as Heracles blurred through the air. It was only the sound of wood being vaporized into sawdust as his weapon blitzed through the trees close enough to be in his range which informed her to duck. The slab passed a hair's breadth above her as it cleaved through the shrubbery around her being and threw up a whirlwind of leaves and dirt. The servants charged in. Canius broke through the surface of the water, trudging her way up the beach as the shook herself free of the droplets of water still clinging to her. The lancer could already hear the sounds of fighting, and see them if the flying trees were any indication, as Heracles fought the enemy servants. The lancer's lip curled into a savage smile as she turned her attention towards the sounds of fighting. Already tensing herself to charge straight into the thick of the fighting. Her instincts flared as she halted whatever plans she made, instead opting to swing her entire body to the side and raise her forearm in a blocking motion. The arrow of light shattered against her skin without leaving so much as a mark. Her eyes shifted away from her forearm and towards the attacker. The smile she had on her face intensified as she caught sight of the distinct figure of Artemis, the woman already preparing to fire another arrow. "That won't do shit," Canius roared, throwing herself forwards into a frantic dash towards the goddess, kicking up a trail of sand behind her as she crossed the beach. "At least you left yourself all to me, bitch." Artemis remained silent as she loosened another arrow. The attack struck Canius on the shoulder and did nothing, leaving not so much as a blemish on her outfit. The goddess shifted her expression into a frown and turned away, flying through the air and disappearing into the woods. "Like hell you're getting away from me." The lancer's roar echoed across the beach as she tore after the goddess, breaking through the treeline and barging through the forest with reckless abandon as she maintained a line of sight on the goddess. Artemis' navigation of the trees was nothing short of stellar. Even while flying she moved with a certain amount of grace as befitted her station, effortlessly gliding around the trees so as to avoid striking them while maintaining her speed. Canius had no such compunctions about style. Orion cringed as he looked over his shoulder. It took him all of a second to spot Canius, the lancer not even bothering to avoid the trees and instead just running through them. Wood splintered into fragments and bushes was ripped up from the ground as the lancer continued her mad dash after them. Hey, when did that guy say he was going to meet us?" Orion questioned aloud, feeling slightly nervous as Canius easily began to close the distance between the two of them. Artemis remained silent, floating over a patch of leaves which appeared to be slightly different from their surroundings. Sinus' grin turned savage as she closed the distance, shifting herself to be ready to thrust into the goddess's back. Her foot slammed against the patch of leaves and fell through. Her eyes widened in shock as she abruptly fell into a hole in the ground. "What the she?" Her cry was cut off by a deep thud as she smacked against the bottom of the pit. The spears which had been buried in the hole pointed upwards bent and broke against her skin. Not without leaving marks however. Canius growled as droplets of blood fell free of her. She clicked her tongue. She was far enough away from the water that Poseidon's blessings were beginning to lose their effectiveness. The lancer got back to her feet, her lips curled into a savage snarl as she looked around the pit, swinging her spear around and destroying the remaining trap weapons. The woman turned her head upwards and tensed her legs, leaping out of the pit and landing back onto the ground with a heavy thud. Her head scanned her surroundings as they attempted to find the goddess again. "You think some fucking pit trap will stop me?" She sneered out loud, her head darting around. "Huh. Where the fuck did you scurry off to, you fucking rat?" She failed to take notice of the silent figure meters behind her. Their form moved through the forest with a disturbing degree of silence, even moving through the bushes produced no sound. The lancer remained ignorant to the presence as she glared at the forest. Several arrows of light emerged from the forest, striking the lancer in the back and causing her to stumble forwards slightly from the impact. She spun her body around to face the direction the arrows had come from before she released a deep growl of annoyance. "There you are." She took off like a bullet, charging through the woods once again. The figure emerged from the bushes as she departed. The face of Ash stared at her form as she vanished through into the bushes. He looked down at the ring upon his hand. The slumbering dragon crest ring hadn't been all that useful before, but in this instance it proved its use. If all went well, Artemis would lure her to the ambush site and he could dispatch her quickly. Canius continued through the bushes. A fleeting image of white moving through the treeline instantly attracted her attention towards it. Her eyes narrowed and her lips curled. "Found you," she roared, adjusting her direction and breaking into as fast a sprint as she could through the woods. Heracles flipped through the air as he avoided the next barrage of arrows, not that he even needed to. As he landed back onto the ground, his head snapped in the direction where Ritska had vanished off to with Euryale. Heracles growled as he shifted his body to take off after them. A flash of deep blue lightning came in from his left side as the form of Sanora manifested itself in front of him. The lancer twirled her cross spear and leveled it towards the berserker. Heracles wasted no time in rushing towards her, swinging his axe sword through the air towards her chest. The woman kicked off the ground and spun her body above the weapon, spinning her body and kicking down into the flat of the weapon with as much force as she could manage. The axe sword was mildly forced downwards, so it slammed into the ground. Heracles threw his body forwards and shoulder barged Sanora as she was still in the air and blasted her away from him. Dozens of arrows emerged from the woods on either side of him aimed at his face. The attack struck against his skin without so much as leaving a mark. However, the explosions they released caused the berserker to growl in annoyance at the attacks. A rumbling thud of something approaching already informed him of what was going to happen again. He swung his sword back across himself towards the incoming sound. A heavy crash echoed across the woods as Heracles slammed his axe sword into Havel's shield. The bishop raised the stone aegis with both hands and stopped the attack dead in its tracks, then released a deep grunt as he pushed it back. Heracles allowed the momentum of the push to carry him back as he rotated his body back around and raised his leg. His heel slammed into Havel's free side and barreled him over and onto the ground. Heracles' foot impacted the ground with a heavy thud as he swung his weapon back into the sky, poised to strike down against the back of the berserker. A dozen beams of light slammed into his chest, forcing him backwards and causing his head to snap in the direction of Drake. The cannons behind the woman's shoulders were already glowing as they primed themselves to fire again. Heracles threw his head forwards and released a roar as he charged down the pirate. Drake widened her eyes and backpedaled as Heracles closed the distance in an instant, swinging his sword to bisect the woman. The axe sword rebounded off Mash's shield with a heavy clang. The shielder thrust her snowflake armament into the ground and pushed it forwards. Heracles stumbled backwards slightly as she pushed with all her might before the two slid to a halt as Heracles found his footing again. He pushed forwards before something struck him in the back of the head. The berserker's face jerked into Mash's shield with a thud. His head snapped backwards to push whatever had attacked him off. Boudica flipped through the air and landed on her feet before charging back towards the berserker again. Heracles swung his sword behind him as the rider dropped to the ground and slid just underneath the sweeping attack. The rider spun around so she faced the berserker again, not bothering to try and strike him for all the good she knew it would do. Heracles' head spun back towards her. Two arms wrapped themselves around his waist and lifted him skywards. Heracles' eyes widened as he was abruptly sent crashing into the floor as Havel bodily slammed him into the ground with a heavy shockwave. Heracles rolled back to his feet as Havel wound his arm back and swung it directly into his nose, crunching it inwards and slamming the back of his head back into the dirt. Heracles' foot lashed out and caught Havel in the chin, forcing him backwards with the impact. Rocketing back to his feet, Heracles glared at the bishop before another barrage from Drake struck him in the chest and forced him backwards in an explosion of smoke. Heracles growled and swept his arm through the cloud to disperse it, only to reveal Mash charging through it with her shield cocked backwards. The girl released a cry as she thrust it into Heracles' collarbone and forced him into a stagger. David slid out and struck the berserker in the back of his left knee with his staff and caused him to flinch and turn his eyes downwards. He raised his left arm upwards, palm still tightly gripping his axe sword, as he glared down at the archer. David retreated instantly, barely managing to avoid being crushed underneath the blow. With his other hand, Heracles swung it forwards in a fist directly into Mash's shield, pushing the girl backwards and causing her feet to scrape along the ground, leaving behind indentations in the dirt. Sanora flipped over his head, thrusting her lance into his eye. Heracles stared at her unblinkingly as the tip bounced off his pupil as she drew the spear back and landed onto her feet. Her head snapped towards him as he released a menacing growl and shifted his body forwards. The lancer dove to the side as he charged her, tearing through the dirt and stopping directly in front of the nearest tree. His free hand stabbed itself into the trunk and ripped it out of the ground with minimal effort. Heracles spun around and shifted the tree into a spear before he hurled it through the woods. The projectile rocketed through their enclosed space, destroying everything in its path as it continued towards its target. Archer widened his eyes in alarm as he leapt into the air. The tree spear smashed straight through the area he had been perched on before disappearing off into the distance. The moment Archer turned his eyes back towards Heracles, they widened as the berserker tore off away from the group and in the direction where Ritska had vanished off in. The other servants were quick to realize the issue, all similarly shooting to their ready positions and charging after the rampaging berserker. Archer bit his lip as he moved through the forest. They were in a terrible situation, and with how desperate Heracles was, it was unlikely they were going to have long before he caught up with the master at the rate they were managing to hold him off. "Master, Heracles broke away from us and he's after you again." Archer warned him through the link as he jumped from tree to tree. Following after Heracles was nothing difficult. The level of destruction he left in his wake produced a very easy trail to follow. "Oh." Ritska's voice came back through the link, sounding understandably panicked at the thought of Heracles chasing him down. The master continued on, How far away is he? We can still see him." Archer informed him. He pursed his lips. He had wanted to keep certain aspects of his abilities close to his chest until the time was right. Showing off all your aces so early on was often a terrible idea. Although this wasn't his usual type of summoning, so it would make sense for him to shift some of his approaches. However, the problem was the magical energy his master could provide him. It wasn't enough to last long. Archer internally exhaled. It was going to have to be enough. "Master, I'm going to try and buy you some time. So I will have to take some magical energy," Archer reported through the link. "All right, do what you have to do. I'm going to head through the trap locations, hopefully he'll fall into one of those." He could feel the disbelief of the master's words through the link. Archer could share them. Canius broke through into the clearing, sliding to a halt as she scanned her surroundings. Her eyes narrowed as she stalked forwards, her grip on her spear tightened as she continued to pace around. "Come out and I'll make it painful," she called out, moving towards the center of the clearing. "Didn't peg you for cowards, but I ain't all that surprised." Dead silence greeted her in response. The lancer growled under her breath as she came to a halt. Her eyes continued to move around the clearing before she huffed, raising her spear upwards and resting it upon her shoulder. Her eyes darted off at the sound of rustling, then narrowed as she caught sight of someone emerging from the woods. Her lips spread into a sneer as Artemis emerged from the woods, Orion clinging to the top of her head as the two came into the open. "There you are," she moved her spear off her shoulder. "Surprised you came out to die. I feel as though you're unjustly blaming me." Orion called out. "I don't like gods either." Artemis nodded her head, then paused and shot her eyes upwards at the bear on her head. Her expression faltered slightly. Not you." Orion chided. "Obviously not you." "Oh, okay." Artemis' expression did a complete 180 from despairing to pleased. Canius watched the two with an expression of pure disgust, grunting as she took a single step forwards. Her instincts flared to life, her eyes darted behind her as she spun around. Cerulean eyes instantly locked onto the form of Ash rushing towards her, the dark platinum sword in his hand thrusting towards her head. The lancer jerked backwards and swung her spear upwards, deflecting the blow upwards and above her shoulder before pivoting her body and slamming her shoulder into his chest. He stumbled backwards with the strike as she charged forwards. "Sneaky little shit," Canius roared as she charged towards the saber, swinging her spear towards his head while his left hand dipped to his side and whipped out a small knife. He parried the spear away from himself while swinging the knife towards her wrist. Canius clasped her free hand around his arm and stopped the attack dead in its tracks. The two struggled against each other before several arrows slammed into her back. She winced from the attack and briefly loosened her hold on Ash. He wrenched his hand free of her grip and swung his head forwards. Canius saw the attack coming and did the same thing. Their two foreheads collided with each other and forced the two backwards. Ash flipped the small knife in his grip so as to reverse it, while leveling his greatsword at the Lancer. "Was going to go for you next," Canius growled as she paced around in front of him, then looked over her shoulder quickly to ascertain that Artemis hadn't left yet. She hadn't. The goddess was still staring at her with her bow raised in preparation. "Saves me some time. Kill both of you without have." Ash rushed her, throwing the knife towards her face. Canius swung her spear upwards and bat the knife away from her face before twirling the spear and raising it up to block the downward strike from the saber. The Lancer scowled and pushed the attack to the side and grabbed his shoulder, throwing him out to the side and in the direct path of Artemis' barrage. The duo widened their eyes as Artemis' arrows of light slammed into his chest and sent him hurtling backwards through the air. Canius let out a bark of laughter as she turned on her heel to face Artemis and threw herself forwards. The second barrage of light arrows struck her a lot harder than they had previously, but didn't slow her run in the least as she closed the distance. She got to within a few feet of the goddess before her instincts flared to life once again. Artemis widened her eyes and shot skywards as she spun around. A trail of black fire snaked itself along the ground towards her. The Lancer snarled and threw her body to the side to avoid it. She frowned at the feeling the fire produced. It was just plain wrong. Her eyes darted back to the saber as he climbed to his feet, looking up at Artemis and then back to her as he shifted his grip on Galvatine and paced towards her. The sword sparked as bright orange flames formed along the blade. She frowned at those two. They were less difficult to discern. Demonic swords had a particular feel to them, and while she couldn't recall ever encountering one in life, the throne provided her with enough info of them. Dismissing the thoughts, she flickered her eyes back to the saber again before the pair rushed towards each other. Ash's left hand freed itself from his sword as he pulled his arm back and slung it forwards, hurtling another black fireball towards the Lancer. Canius rolled under the attack and back to her feet as they closed the distance. Ash thrust his sword towards her at the same time she swung her spear upwards. The two blows clashed against each other before the pair fell into a brutal fight. Ash's fighting style was the same as it had always been. Heavy slashes intermittent with the occasional blast of fire to keep his opponent off balance. Canius grunted as she avoided another explosion near the side of her face. The Lancer ducked low and struck him in the knee with a full-powered kick. Ash hobbled with the blow and provided the Lancer with the opening to swing her spear around and strike him in the side of the head with the pole. Ash grunted and swung his left arm out while releasing a burst of continuous fire towards the Lancer. Canius took the heat head on and winced as her skin started to redden from the attack before she released a roar. Twirling the spear around, she thrust it towards the unkindled's guts. Ash instantly cut off the fire and lowered his hand to clasp around the shaft of the spear to stop himself being run through. Growling, he swung his sword towards the Lancer's head. Ducking her head low, Canius released a grunt of pain as the edge of the sword clipped the top of her head as Ash swung over it, cutting away a small portion of her hair but otherwise leaving her unharmed. Then his sword burst into flames like a jet engine. She widened her eyes and ducked back as the sword swung back through the air the way it had come via rocket propulsion from the burst of fire. She slammed her palm into his nose and forced him to step backwards. She pointedly ignored the arrows shattering off her back, even if they did not start to feel like pinpricks, as she continued her advance. The unkindled saber watched her advance and prepared himself for her next attack, sweeping Galvatine back through the air and unleashing a wave of chaos flames at the Lancer. Canius threw herself in close, hissing through her teeth as the flames washed over her, and tackled the saber to the ground. Ash was quick to hook his arm around her waist and unleash a blast of abyssal fire directly onto her. That prompted a more volatile reaction than he expected. The explosion threw her off as she released a more pained cry, her hand flying to the burn mark before she glared at him. The two quickly shot to their feet before another arrow of light flew in and struck the lancer again. Canius glared up in annoyance before shifting her eyes back to Ash as the saber swung towards her. Raising her spear, she blocked the attack with the pole arm and thrust her fist in a quick jab into his throat. Ash recoiled from her but didn't do the usual reaction of coughing heavily, instead leveling the point of his sword towards her feet. She got the idea when the blade suddenly glowed with brilliant white light. The aura shifted from demonic to holy in an instant and released a jet of pure light at her feet. The explosion of holy power threw her off balance and allowed Ash to take advantage. Moving in close, he swung his left hand upwards and slammed his knuckle into her chin, snapping her head back before his hand opened up and he thrust the flat of his palm against her chest. Another explosion of black fire launched Canius away from him and into a rolling retreat. Ash climbed back to his feet as Canius rose to hers. The lancer glared at him, her eyes darted towards the goddess and then back to him before a snarl broke free of her throat. The lancer charged towards Ash faster than she had previously, even with the hefty burn mark in the shape of a palm over the top of her ribs, and closed the distance rapidly. Ash swung downwards as she gripped her spear in two hands. Then jumped into the air, completely passing over the top of Ash's slice as she flipped over him. Ash's eyes turned upwards as he tracked her movements and already made to turn himself towards her. Canius thrust the butt of her spear downwards as she passed over the top of the saber. The weapon slammed into the top of his right eye and forced him to clench the optical nerve closed and wince. The moment her feet touched the ground, she spun around and buried the edge of the spear into his side, the mirror chain splitting as the spear met flesh. Canius made to rip the spear out before she got struck in the back. A burst of power washed over her as she was thrown into a roll as Ash staggered away from her. The woman spun around to see Artemis floating next to Ash, the goddess having rammed her bow into the lancer's back, already releasing arrows towards her and forcing her backwards. The lancer growled at every hit, while nothing detrimental, which met its mark, proving an annoyance. The real threat to her was the saber, who was already turning to face her with his right eye still clenched shut with his left having locked onto her. She snarled as he broke into another run towards her, his left hand moving towards the box at his waist as he closed the distance. Canius snarled and rushed towards him and thrust the spear towards him as the hand came back out while holding something in its grasp. Ash shifted his body, allowing the spear to penetrate through his right shoulder and growling as it passed through his body. Canius blinked in surprise at the obvious tanking of her attack for barely half a second. It was more than enough time for Ash to act. Raising his left hand, he threw whatever he had in his hand directly into her face and kicked her in the gut at the same time. The substance splattered across her eyes and blocked her vision as she stumbled backwards. For a few moments she assumed he had thrown mud or something along the like in her face. Then the smell hit her. And she understood, on some primal level, that he had not thrown mud at her. He had thrown something much worse into her eyes. Rage exploded forth in the form of a roar as she wiped her eyes clean, then a flash of pain flickered through her side as she snapped her eyes downwards. Ash had the small curved knife in his hand buried down to its grip in her left side in a reverse grip. The woman screamed at him, backhanding him away and loosening his grip around the dagger and forcing him into a roll as he cleared the distance. Her hand clasped around the handle of the small dagger, oddly looking exactly the same as the one he had thrown at her, and tossed it away without a second thought. The only thing she could think of was how much she was going to kill him. "I'm gonna tear out your fucking spine," she screamed to the heavens while glaring at Ash, her eyes flashing from blue to red. She took single step forwards and staggered, her eyes flickered as nausea assaulted her body. Her head turned down to the area where she had been stabbed. Deep purple liquid seeped from the wound. "Uf fuckin'," she grunted as her eyes turned back to the saber. A fresh wave of anger coursed through her body, soon followed by another wave of sickness. Ash rose to his feet without showing a hint of emotion on his face as he closed the distance towards the lancer, his eyes still forced shut as he approached, shifting his arm to accommodate for the hole in his shoulder while being completely uncaring as to its existence. He raised Galvatine above his head as he approached. Canius planted her spear into the ground and heaved, blinking rapidly from the poison taking effect on her being. The moment Ash got close enough, she moved. The saber widened his eyes at the sudden burst of speed as she shot towards him, swinging his sword through the air and slamming it through her collarbone and into her body. At the same time she thrust her spear forwards and ran him through directly into his gut and out the back of his body. The two stared at each other, Canius with Ash's greatsword lodged in her torso and Ash with her spear skewered through his guts. Canius spat out a glob of blood onto the ground between them. Then slammed her forehead into his face. Ash recoiled from the blow as her hand left the shaft of her spear and clasped around his shoulder, flipping him over her body and roughly onto the ground before twisting his arm. Ash hissed in pain as something jarred before she raised her boot and stomped down on his wounded arm. Bone crunched under the impact and managed to earn a deep groan from Ash in response. She managed to punch him again before another barrage of arrows caused her to almost topple forwards. The greatsword still lodged in her chest made balance a pressing issue for her. It got worse when Ash swept his left out and slammed his boot into the back of her knee. She reacted on instinct and jerked her leg forwards. Ash rolled away from her, only succeeding in forcing the spear deeper through his body before he climbed back to his feet. Even with poison flowing through her body, Canius still had enough wits about her to turn around and face the saber as he threw a punch towards her head. Canius scowled and caught the fist in her hand before swinging her other elbow up and smashing it against his chin. The unkindled staggered backwards only for Canius to pull him forwards with the hand she still held tightly and slam her knee into his left side where she had been able to slash with her spear. Ash's body jolted with the impact as she wound her knee back to kick him again. Artemis using her bow like a club and slamming it over the back of her head put an end to that particular plan. Even with her skin still protecting her against the goddess, it could do nothing to adjust to the impact, which the poison made worse. She turned around and leveled a hefty glare at the goddess and swung her fist towards her. Artemis widened her eyes and raised her bow in a blocking measure. Her fist stopped barely an inch from the goddess' defense. Her eyes darted towards it to see Ash's left-handed gauntlet firmly clasped around her arm. The saber pulled her back, swinging her around to face him. Canius was prepared for many things, considering he only had one working arm at present, although what she wasn't expecting was for him to use his broken right arm like a club and strike her in the side of the face with it. The limb whipping her across the head as it flopped around uselessly at his side. Ash winced in pain from the impact before he raised his left hand and gripped his wounded forearm. Bone clicked and snapped as he shunted the limb back into place. Barely giving a second thought before he drew the arm across himself and swung it in a backhanded motion across the other side of Canius' face. The Lancer's eyes burned before she swung her fist low and struck Ash in his gut, just underneath the entry point of the spear. Ash heaved with the blow before her hand lashed out and she thrust her thumb into the spear wound in his right shoulder. Ash growled in response, raising his left hand and clasping it over the side of her face. Sinus' response to the growing heat of flames and deep sizzling was to spear her hand through the wound in Ash's gut. The pyromancy glove released a jet of black fire which waved over the right side of Canius' face and caused the Lancer to scream in both pain and rage as she continued to stab the saber with her hands. Her hand shifted in his gut until it clasped the spear and twisted it. Ash hissed with the pain and tightly gripped his greatsword with his right hand and began to pull downwards while channeling magical energy through the blade. Chaos flames poured out of the sword and burned away at the Lancer before he raised his leg and kicked her in the gut, wrenching his greatsword from her body, and her hands from his, with a sickening pop as they both fell backwards. Ash vomited out a small puddle of blood as he raised his head to glare at the Lancer as she glared back, her left hand dangling limply as he had parted her shoulder from the rest of her body. Sinu's eyes flickered slightly before she vomited up another wave of blood, this time the liquid having a purple dye to it as she stumbled on her feet. Then fell backwards and flat onto her back with a wet splatter. The saber staggered backwards and clasped his hand around the spear, slowly pulling it free. With a final grunt of exertion, he ripped the spear from his chest and tossed it away from himself. His eyes turned back towards the Lancer as she lay on the ground glaring up at him, her face still caked in the dung pie and the poison from the throwing dagger having clearly affected her more than it would him. He supposed that might have related to the fact she was human, or thereabout, and he wasn't. Coughing out another glob of blood, her eyes locked onto his as her body already began to fade into motes of light. Her eyes flashing red a final time. "All fucking get you," she sputtered out as her head fell backwards. Ash remained silent as she vanished before letting out a sigh as the final remnants of her body disappeared. He shifted Galvatine and stabbed it into the ground, using the hilt of the sword as a stand for himself to rest upon as he turned his head to stare at Artemis and Orion, both of whom were staring at him with no small amount of concern. "Hey," Orion coughed out, "so, you're not about to die?" Ash tilted his head, then shook it. "No. It will take more than that to kill me," he replied, forcing himself straight, "although I admit she came close." "Yeah, what did you stab her with?" "Poison dagger." Ash replied instantly. "Well, a throwing dagger, but the effect remains the same," he grunted. "And the," Orion gestured to the area around his eyes. "Dung pie." "Dung." Orion sputtered, "You threw actual shit in her face." "Yes." Ash nodded his head, then titled it, "What? Why did you even have that on you?" "To throw." "Fucking hell." Orion shook his head, "Remind me never to shake hands with you." "All right." Ash nodded his head, "You should rejoin with the others. I will call upon Ritska to return me." "Looking like that." Orion blinked at him, "You look like you're about to fall over." Ash shrugged, "It matters not." He simply replied, "Master, Canis is dead, I request transport over to you." "All right." Ritska replied back. "Hey, wait. Orion barely got a word out before the saber vanished into thin air, the command seal transporting him away. His bare hand lowered. "Talk about stubborn. Stubborn kid as well." "I think it's a little funny." Artemis admitted, "It's a little bit like you, but he doesn't have your charm, darling." She shrugged, then floated into the air. "Let's go." The flash of red was soon followed by the form of Ash appearing as the command seal did its work. "Hey," as "oh my god," were the first words out of Ritska's mouth as he gaped at the side the saber was in. His right eye was now bruised heavily with trace amounts of blood leaking from underneath it. There was a hole running directly through his gut from where he had clearly been stabbed with a similar wound on his shoulder. His left side had a slash through it which looked no better. The saber, for lack of a better word, looked like he was moments from falling over. "Fujimaru-kun, I assume Ash has oh my word." Romani's voice soon followed. "Ash. What's with these wounds?" "Canis was more challenging than I anticipated." Ash replied back, then looked over to Ritska again and down. "I see the goddess remains unharmed." "That is fortunate." Euryale stared at him. "Off to die are you?" "I should hope not." Ash replied back with a frown, then looked over Ritska's shoulder. "Heracles is that way then?" He didn't wait for an answer before he grunted and pulled his sword free of the ground and rested it against his shoulder, making to move past the master before Ritska stood in front of him. "What the heck, Ash?" Ritska stared at him in surprise. "If you go out to fight anyone like that, you're gonna end up dead." "I am more than confident in my ability to absorb damage." Ash replied, making to step around the master before Ritska moved again. Ash's face pulled into a frown. I was under the impression I was required to kill Heracles. You are, you fool. Olga took over from Romani, but going out to fight looking as dead as you claim to be is a surefire way for everyone else to follow after you. The servants can delay Heracles long enough for you to try and heal yourself to a moderate degree or for Fujimaru to use his healing spells attached to the mystic code on you. Ash stared at her, opening his mouth to reply before a roar from Heracles shook the forest around them. The trio turned their heads in the direction of the battle roar as the thumping increased in volume. Ash turned his attention back towards Olga. We have not the time for it. I will simply have to make do with what I have available to me. Besides, I have been in worse situations than this. But not fighting the likes of Heracles. Olga shouted back, you need to get it through that dull head of yours that you could very easily wind up dead and take the rest of us with you if you rush off in there like some buffoon. Ash remained silent as she panted, now sit down, shut up, and let Fujimaru heal you. While I wouldn't phrase it quite like that. Romani muttered out, then stared at Ash with a troubled expression. The director is correct, you should at least allow Fujimaru-kun to heal the worst of your injuries before trying to face Heracles. Ash remained silent for a few moments before he nodded his head once. Do what you can, but I advise you to be quick. I do not know how long the others can hold out. Boudica's chariot tore through the trees as it chased down Heracles, his form long since becoming clear as the three servants, and one Grail-powered human, in the back of the chariot stared out in front of them. Sanora sprinted behind the chariot as fast as she could while Havel ran behind her at a much slower pace. The unfortunate problem was that he was simply far too heavy to fit in the chariot itself. Archer projected his sleek black bow and planted it in the base of the chariot as he stared at Heracles' back. He exhaled as he held up his other hand. Boudica stared at him out of the corner of her eye while whipping the reins and spurring the two horses on faster. Archer muttered something under his breath as the air around him shifted, holding out his right hand. A jagged black blade formed in his palm which he then proceeded to knock into the bow. He tensed as he pulled the string as far back as it would go until it began to groan. Archer exhaled as he locked onto Heracles' back. Even with the chariot ride being as rough as it didn't matter for this particular arrow of his. Soar, Hound of the Red Plains. Archer muttered under his breath as cracks spread across the weapon as it overflowed with power, grunting. He released the arrow towards Heracles. The projectile disappeared into a red beam of light as it instantly shattered the sound barrier with a thunderous boom, buffeting at the surrounding servant's hair. Heracles slid to halt, clearly having already sensed the power behind the attack, and spun his body around as the beam closed it. The berserker swung his axe sword up at near impossible speeds and parried the arrow into the air in a spiral of light. Archer remained stone-faced as the arrow continued into the sky before halting itself and shooting back down towards Heracles. The berserker opened his mouth to release a roar before the arrow slammed down into him, piercing through his collar and directly into his body with enough force to stagger him before it exploded, shredding the left side of his torso and consuming his body in an explosion of flames. Archer didn't bother looking to his left where the other servants on the chariot were staring at him. Right on cue, the shock wave from the explosion hit them. Boudica cracked the reins again as the servants rode in and slid to a halt, all jumping off the chariot and circling around the cloud of smoke. A rustling off the trees had Archer's eyes dart behind them just in time to see Atalanta emerge once again. He had wondered where she had vanished off to. The cloud dispersed as Heracles' form released a wave of steam. His body righted itself as it shifted back into its pristine condition. The servant's eyes formed and then swept across the ground in front of him before they landed on Atalanta for a brief moment. The archer stared back at him with a tense frown. This is stupid, Heracles. Jason is always leading you on these harebrained schemes of his. she pointed out, drawing her bow and preparing an arrow. Heracles stared at her in silence, his eyes briefly flickering away from her before they returned. The berserker released a deep growl, earning a sigh from the feline archer. "I suppose I should have expected as much. Really, what did that bumbling fool ever do to earn a friend like you?" Sanor erupted from between the trees and into the open, sliding to a halt next to Archer. The lion-headed knight then whispered to him, "Our pitfall is a few meters away." Archer grunted in response, eyes flickering just past Heracles and towards the ground behind him. The slight shift in the coloration of leaves indicated where they had built their trap before his eyes flickered back to Heracles as the servant tensed himself, shifting his body and then snapping his eyes onto Archer. He grimaced at being singled out. This was why he liked to keep things close to his chest. Heracles released a roar and charged towards them. Mash rushed in and raised her shield high, once again blocking the attack from the berserker with only a strained grunt escaping from her lips being any indication of what she was attempting. Heracles growled as he forced her back as the servants rushed in on either side of him. Atalanta jumped through the air, loosening dozens of arrows at the berserker, all of which shattered against his skin, while Sanora charged towards him on his right while Boudica charged in on his left. David rushed in behind Mash and Drake was already bringing out her next salvo of cannons. She fired the beams of light towards Heracles, slamming into his body and staggering him away from Mash while Boudica rushed in from the side, attempting to keep him off balance and force him backwards, she not doubt having recognized the pitfall trap as well, and while it wouldn't stop him for very long, it would at least delay him for precious seconds which were almost an eternity in these situations. Heracles stamped his foot into the ground, shaking the very earth beneath his feet before swinging his entire body towards the rider. Boudica raised her shield and tanked the hit head-on, the force blowing her off her feet and sending her spiraling through the air. Heracles made to follow after her before a cry from his right side snapped his head around just in time for Sanora to land a two-footed kick against his cheek. Heracles grunted with the impact as the lancer this time used her feet to kick off his head to avoid being grabbed again. Heavy crashing thumps emerged from the forest as Havel caught up with the group, the berserker having foregone his weapon entirely and instead rushed straight towards Heracles with his bare hands. The demigod flashed his eyes towards Havel and charged towards him, barreling past Mash and sending her skating away as he swung down at Havel. The stone bishop raised his forearms in a blocking motion as the axe sword slammed into him and very nearly toppled him over. Havel grunted as he stepped forwards and pushed the weapon away from his body and swung his fist low into Heracles' kidney. The berserker grunted before his left hand lashed out and struck Havel over the side of the head, who retaliated with a series of brutal jabs into his body. The three punches collided with his side and ribs before Havel punched down against his wrist holding the slab sword and jerked it from his hand. Heracles grunted, now unarmed as well, before he went on the offensive. The demigod's movements blurred as he unleashed a rapid series of punches against Havel, chipping away at his stone armor and releasing shockwaves with every hit as he continued to force the bishop back. Havel raised his arms in a block to hide away his face as Heracles continued to throw punch after punch. When he pulled his arm back and threw it forwards towards his head, Havel ducked low, the punch whiffing over his helmet, and twisted his body around the missed arm and latched onto it. Heracles widened his eyes as Havel threw the berserker over his shoulder and slammed his body into the ground with an earth-shattering thud. Raising his boot up, Havel stomped down onto Heracles' face as hard as he could. The berserker's head dented the ground with the force of the stomp before Havel lashed out and roughly grabbed him by the hair, yanking him upwards and slamming his face into the waiting knee. Cocking his right arm back, Havel wound up a haymaker and threw it towards the already dazed berserker. Heracles' eyes flashed red before he released a roar. His hand rose up and clamped down around the flying fist and halted it. His other hand swung upwards and smashed into Havel's far leg, jerking the bishop backwards and allowing the berserker to shoot to his feet. Heracles roared as the hand which had punched the knee swung upwards and clasped itself around Havel's head, pulling the berserker off his feet and slamming him into the ground with an earth-shattering explosion. Heracles stepped away from the berserker lying in the bottom of the crater, turning his head to the side as his instincts flared. He leaned back to avoid Masha's shield striking him in the head. Swinging his arm upwards, he caught the shielder in the gut with an uppercut. Her eyes bulged as oxygen was violently forced out of her body as she flew skywards. "How much longer?" Ash asked as Ritska held his hand over the wound in his gut. The master had sweat running down his face from repeated use of the first aid spell. "I don't," he exhaled, breathing heavily as his arm fell back to his side. Ash frowned at the movement and turned his eyes back in the direction of the sounds of conflict, then looked back at Ritska, already standing back up again. "Wait, we cannot." Ash shook his head. "You are exhausted as is." His eyes narrowed. "What is happening?" Ritska winced. "Archer is using something to delay Heracles, that's all," he said. The master replied, "But that doesn't mean. They need help and I will provide it." He grunted, ignoring the brief flash of discomfort which flooded through his body as he gripped his greatsword and pulled it out of the ground. "We can delay no longer. And with how he is." Olga pointed at Ritska through the screen. "With how exhausted he is, do you think it even possible to start blasting off noble phantasms without killing him?" Ash frowned, his eyes turned downwards before they narrowed. "The issue is magical energy?" he inquired, looking back at Olga. The woman blinked in surprise at the question before she nodded her head. "If he were a stronger mage, then you might be able to deploy your noble phantasms, but with how he is now you'll more than likely get maybe 2 or 3 before he passes out from exhaustion," she informed him, "which means we might have to think of a new plan or—" "You said the basin Oscar held was akin to a Holy Grail." "Yes." Olga tilted her head. "It is, what does that have to?" Ash wasted no time in flipping the bottomless box open and pulling the large golden basin out. He stared at it for a few moments before he moved it towards his body. "What the hell are you doing?" Olga shrieked. "Are you trying to force it into you? You said it was a holder of magical energy. I am simply going to use it in a fashion similar to Drake." Ash replied as the dish began to glow. "That will solve the issue of magical energy. You can't just put a Holy Grail into yourself." Romani sputtered in shock. Francis Drake was chosen by the Grail of this era to wield its power. The other servants we encountered all received their Holy Grails from Lev or whoever else is behind this. The doctor went on. Ash briefly flickered his gaze to him. "If you try and force a Grail into your body without first understanding what it can do, the chances are it will rip your container to pieces. We don't know enough about the Grails we recovered to start trying to infuse them into." Ash pressed the basin into his body, hunching over as magical energy instantly burned its way through his body. The people in front of him gaped at the sudden display as Ash hobbled around on his feet. "Are you insane?" came the frantic cries across the communicator. "Take it out of you before." Rising back to his feet, Ash exhaled heavily and turned his eyes to Ritska. "I will be back soon." He nodded to the master, who was still dumbfounded by the display, before he turned away and took off in a sprint in the direction of the conflict. Ritska watched him run before his mouth eventually caught up with what he had witnessed. "What the hell?" he shouted out after the saber. "Ash." His eyes turned to the screen. "Wahi. Romani, get on those readings." Olga directed the man, "And monitor Fujimaru." She turned to him. "How are you feeling?" "No different," he reported, still looking between the director and Ash. "Did he is that safe?" "I don't know." Romani called through the screen. "His readings are all jumbled up at the moment. His container hasn't been expanded enough to handle this sudden influx of power, so it's trying to accommodate for." He paused, eyes flickering as they searched for something. "Wait, that's Romani. What is it? The doctor looked back at Ritska and then the director before he shook his head. It's nothing, just another weird reading. He dismissed. Going back to the monitor, his vitals are looking more impressive and the magical energy cost has been cut down due to the power he's receiving from the Grail. The fortunate news is that his mana stat means he's not going to blow up. He can only channel so much magical energy at a time, but if he holds onto it for any considerable length of time. What will happen? I don't know. The doctor threw his hands up. That's the problem. The only servants we've encountered with Grails are ones who have been the rightful owners of them or had them specially gifted to them. I've never seen someone just shove it into their chest and run off. Keep monitoring him, Olga directed, then looked back at Ritska. You, keep moving to the rendezvous site and don't stop for anything else. Ritska nodded his head, hooking his arms under Euryale and breaking into another jog. The goddess stared at him with an indiscernible expression. You know you can just summon him again if he dies, right? I'm not going to entertain that idea right now. Ritska replied back as he ran, his expression steeled. That just means I'd see him as little more than a disposable tool. I don't want him dying any more than I wanted Asterios or Oscar to die. Euryale stared at him before she released a soft huff of amusement, looking away from him. How noble of you. Ash felt as though his whole body was burning. The wounds he had received were already starting to sport cracks across his body. Right now though, that was something that didn't concern him in the least. He needed to get to them and aid in killing Heracles. That was the greatest threat they faced, and if that meant he would have to suffer harm to do so, it was nothing out of the ordinary. He wasn't in any particular rush to die. That would mean he would fail in his duty of serving Ritska, but this was one of those times where it was more important to value the duty than himself. If they dealt with Heracles, then the issue of Jason and the others could be easily dealt with, therefore it was necessary to deal with Heracles quickly. He continued to sprint as fast as he could as he approached the sounds of fighting. The roars of Heracles, already growing in volume, were soon followed by the crashing of trees and earth. Galvatine burst into life with chaos flames until it glowed a brilliant orange as he charged. The unfortunate truth was that even with all the reserve magical energy he could feel coursing through his body, he was still injured following his fight with Canis. His right eye was still forced shut and right arm from the shoulder down was numb because of all the damage he had taken to it. He could only hope that it wouldn't pose too great an issue. And Grail jacked Ash running around like a madman. Also, this is going to be a one-time thing. Because funnily enough, shoving a Grail into an ill-fitting container is a terrible idea. This is why you level people to max. So at the moment it's basically a super version of Power Within, where it is damaging him to actually use all that magical energy. But hey, he gets to throw around stuff willy-nilly, so, progress.